I think for as long as I remember, and this now is quite several decades, at least for 55 years of my political memory, the U.S. has been at war, almost nonstop. And this goes with the territory, and we're at war again, because the war in Ukraine is a U.S. war with Russia, in which Ukraine is the territory. Ukrainians are dying, Americans are fighting, funding, and defining the war aims. So this goes back a long time. My political life began marching on the streets of Detroit, Michigan against the Vietnam War. My political awareness began with the Pentagon Papers, which explained that American leaders lied repeatedly about the war, mainly to get to the next election. And Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, wrote a wonderful essay in 1970, which has stuck with me for 52 years, where he said the quagmire myth and the stalemate machine. And he was trying to explain why the U.S. was stuck in Vietnam. And he said that the usual expression is, we walked into a quagmire. And he said that is not the right model. The right model is what he called the stalemate machine, which is never admit defeat before the next election. But since there's always a next election, you never have the opportunity to admit defeat. It was only with Richard Nixon's impeachment that actually Gerald Ford was able to end the war in Vietnam. Otherwise, it would probably have gone on for another 50 years if it had been continuous presidential administrations. We specialize in perpetual war for two reasons. One, the wars are almost always a mistake because they are an attempt to address political issues through military means in a completely flawed way. And then once in, they can't be stopped, almost without exception, or at least until 15 or 20 years has led to exhaustion. So we were in Afghanistan for 20 full years, from 2001 to 2021. Biden used his first year to pull out of Afghanistan. I thought maybe there would be a year of peace, but that was a little naive on my part, because instead of negotiating with Putin at the end of 2021 over very pertinent issues like the enlargement of NATO to Ukraine, which is the main casus belli of this war, Biden said, I will not negotiate. And so we find ourselves back at war once again. I find all of this deeply disturbing, but am extraordinarily worried that we are about to enter more war in Asia, because we are actually in two fronts now. One is the war in Ukraine, which continues to threaten to expand because, again, the model now is never allow defeat. If anything is on that path, escalate, which is not good when it's two nuclear superpowers. That's a pretty dangerous logic, but that is the prevailing logic. And if you criticize it, you're called a Putin apologist, which I am not, I want to say right at the beginning. I am nobody's apologist. I just don't like perpetual wars and think that we ought to use other means to resolve these issues. But the United States doctrine, unfortunately, is now rather explicit, and that is that to be secure, the U.S. must be the predominant power in each region of the world. So I liken it to a game that I played when I was young called Risk, which is a board game where the aim of the game is to have your piece on every part of the world map. And if you have your pieces on all but a few parts of the map, those places where you don't control could win back the territory that you have. So you're trying to have every piece on the board. Well, the United States has military bases in 80 countries around the world, but alas for the United States, there are 193 countries, so there's a lot of wars to go. Because every place where we have a base, but there isn't a base next door, Americans feel a threat, or we're told to feel a threat. And moreover, of course, and the deeper point is, China is now perceived by the United States as an existential threat to American primacy, because American policymakers cannot understand how we made the mistake of letting China become a powerful country. This was not in the playbook. China was supposed to develop in a way that is subservient to the United States. And so now we call it a failure that we made various mistakes, like letting China in the World Trade Organization or letting China play institutionally. This is obviously a mistake. Not, in my view, because China did anything wrong, and as a development economist, and I think a pretty good one and a pretty knowledgeable one, I would tell you that China has managed economic development better than just about any place in world history, with a lot of skill and a tremendously high saving rate and a tremendous determination to catch up from a century of impoverishment, and they've done it quite brilliantly, in fact. But in the US view, they cheated, and now they have to be punished for threatening American security. So every day you read stories about how the US is cutting off technology to China, telling all of us, don't you dare buy a Huawei phone, don't you dare use Chinese technology. Every day, new companies are listed on the so-called entity list, which is the American enemies list of foreign enterprises. And all of this is to say briefly that we're threatening a second front of war right now. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was an exemplar of complete irresponsibility, complete provocation, complete disrespect to another major power, complete abnegation of the one China policy after we had been asked repeatedly, do not go right now. And it's like, in my view, although I have to tell you, everybody hates me for saying it in the United States. I just got more hate mail before I walked on the stage. It's the same kind of provocations that led to the war in Ukraine. We'll talk about that. I'm supposed to say that this is an unprovoked war that started on February 24th because Putin is an irrational madman who thinks he's Peter the Great. That is the official line. This is not how the war started. This is not the background to the conflict. This is not an understanding, nor is it an approach that could possibly end this war safely. This war started when the United States decided it would move NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. And if you look on a map, the idea quite explicitly laid out by Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom I knew, and who really did not like Russia as a true Polish patriot, was that we could have NATO in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, thereby surrounding Russia in the Black Sea, in Sevastopol. And this is, to my mind, just the second Crimean War, because that was the idea of Palmerston and Napoleon III, and we're at it again. Boris Johnson fantasized that he was Palmerston. I don't know what the Americans think, but in any event, I'm worried about a two-front war that continues to spread, because right now, one is not allowed to say one word of what I've just told you in the mainstream US media, to have this debate, to discuss the origins of the crisis, to say anything other than we fully support Ukraine, which to my mind means loving them to death, to their death. And I warned the Ukrainians that at the start of this, that they would become the Afghanistan of Europe. And by that I meant years and years of destruction, all in a patriotic call to battle. Austria's State Treaty of 1955 is one of the great successes of diplomacy of modern history, a demonstration of how actually to make peace with a belligerent counterpart, something that has made this country remarkably successful. And I wish the lesson were understood for Ukraine, because Ukraine could have learned from Austria. Instead, Austria is often told, stop your neutrality. Please don't do that. We should really understand that a bit of mutual prudence, a bit of regard for another superpower can go a long way to preventing war, but not if you're aiming to put your piece on every spot of the map. So I'll stop there. As you can tell, I'm not enamored of U.S. foreign policy right now, but I can tell you my views are decidedly in a minority in the United States, and not quite acceptable for polite company. So I apologize if I've been impolite.
When it comes to foreign policy, while this has shifted over time, still, I think your observation is basically correct, that there is a core belief. You look at the military budget that has increased year after year, and I don't call it a defense budget. That's one of the Orwellian terms in the United States media and politics. We don't have a lowercase d defense budget. We have a military budget. If it was a defense budget, truly, it would be half the size of what it is. The United States has 750 military bases overseas. Russia has, what, 3 dozen? China maybe has 8 or 10. This is absurd, the extent to which the United States has military deployments and expenditures, but it's absurdity with a purpose. There's a tacit wish for regime change in Russia. So how can you have a world where one nuclear superpower is aspiring to regime change in the other nuclear? It's insane. It's a prescription for global holocaust. And even though the neoliberal rhetoric might include we have to deal with the twin threats of climate emergency, and even though it's not talked about nearly enough, the nuclear war danger, in form of practice, there has to be a recognition that the neoliberal model just cannot, not only cannot deal with the climate emergency, but it propels us closer to a nuclear conflagration because of the militarism that is inherent in the profit taking. I mean, it's enormously profitable. These arms that are being shipped to Ukraine equal billions of dollars in profits just in the last year for U.S. military contractors. The United States has, what, 5% of the world's population? And yet the arrogance that is so inherent in U.S. foreign policy is totally in contradiction to the human realities on the planet. Well, these politicians are leaders who are not what people deserve. When I went to Iran about 10 years ago, more 12 years ago, and I was talking with people, and one person who was selling garments in the bazaar said, people everywhere, we want peace, and our leaders are getting in the way of what we want. And I think that's very true. In the case of Russia, we have the example, we're told Boris Johnson from Britain intervened early this year to prevent meaningful negotiations between Zelensky and Putin governments. And I think that it's a view that this is a zero-sum game, that the world is carved up and the United States has to have as big a piece of the pie as possible. I think it's a classic empire attitude. It's very hard for people in the United States, and certainly the leadership will never acknowledge this is an empire. The United States more and more relies on its military because its economic prowess is not what it was to enforce its empire capacities. And finding a rationality from it, I think, is difficult because it depends on what your standards are. If your standards are what would be better for everybody on the planet in terms of nurturing lives, protecting the environment, having safeguards to prevent wars, then you would have a one set of standards, which I think are the rational, humane standards. If it's how can the United States advance what is commonly in the mass media in this country called national security, then they define that as make the United States as dominant and strong as possible on the planet and look out for other people who might and other forces that might get in the way. There was a CIA agent who later became a critic, a progressive critic of the Central Intelligence Agency, John Stockwell, and he wrote a book titled In Search of Enemies. And I think that is a great description of the United States foreign policy, especially militarily. I mean, when you think about it, the Soviet Union was a gift to the United States because we know, the United States was supporting bloodthirsty dictators in Latin America, the Somozas and so many, for a century or more. What was it? The general said, I was a racketeer for business in Nicaragua. This has been historic. This was going on for so long. And then when the excuse could be used, we're fighting communism. And then that was a lie, a rationale. It was a rationalization. So you have Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala, overthrown with U.S. help. You have, of course, the terrible coup in Brazil in the middle of 1960s that ushered in fascism there. You had, of course, support for Pinochet's coup in Chile. We have many other examples. And the rationale in the United States was, well, maybe it's not pretty, but we have to stop the communists. It was like completely a vicious, lying rationalization for inflicting tremendous suffering and attacks on democracy in the hemisphere. Okay, then 1990 comes along. Then we're supposedly at the end of the Cold War. There's no more Cold War. Well, you have to find more enemies. How can you justify a huge Pentagon budget without other enemies? And so 9/11 was sort of a gift then. I mean, there was supposed to be a peace dividend in the 1990s. It didn't really materialize much, but at least it wasn't this huge escalator of military spending that's so lucrative for the military contractors in the United States. But then 9/11 came along. And at that point, there could gear up the misnamed so-called war on terror. And so that was extremely lucrative. And all of a sudden, there were new companies and more profitable companies in the Washington, D.C. area, around the Pentagon, around the National Security Agency in Maryland and near Baltimore and so forth. And they were able to gin up tremendous spending, especially for these intel outfits and, of course, then the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so that was a boon for them. But how long could that last? I mean, after all, 9/11 was inflicted with box cutters. How do you justify year after year billions and billions of dollars of new expenditures on weaponry against box cutters? I mean, in the longer run, or, suicide cars packed with explosives. So they're able to rationalize it because of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. But then that has sort of dissipated. Well, there's a tremendous need for suitable enemies politically and financially for the war profiteers, the blood money by the billions of dollars. So this is sort of a long-winded way of sort of charting a general evolution to Russia. Now it's back to Russia, you know. And if you go to the presidential debate, one of them between President Barack Obama and Mitt Romney in 2012, when Romney talked about how Russia was a threat, Obama responded, "Oh, come on, you're living in the past about Russia being a threat," because they thought Russia would be sort of still domesticated to the U.S. Desires, as Yeltsin had been. But Putin found himself crossed up by, and you alluded to this earlier, Nima, about how can these people just go around lying all the time, not agree to not follow through adhering to treaties that they signed. And, you know, I think Putin got fed up, not to justify in any way his policies, but he got really fed up with the U.S. lying about how it was going to adhere to agreements with Russia. And so it gets us to now, which I think is very, very dangerous, because the forces that are prevailing in terms of U.S. foreign policy inside this country, they've got Russia totally demonized. They have China largely demonized. And it's really up to activists in the United States, and it's up to activists and leaders in other countries of the world to say that is like completely unacceptable, and we're not going to put up with it.